He's a principal with Lazier Capital Partners Limited, which is an investment bank and private equity firm. He has more than 25 years of experience in commercial lending, private equity, and investment banking, and has funded over $1 billion of capital. Ted's focus has been working with middle market chief executives to achieve their capital objectives. This has included transactions to sell their companies, refinance existing debt, obtain mezzanine and equity investments, and achieve ownership transfers. Prior to joining Lazier, Ted Lape worked in senior roles at LaSalle Bank in Chicago, Fifth Third, and Bank One, as well as being a partner with the private equity firm Talisman Capital Partners. Ted received his MBA from the University of Chicago and his undergraduate degree from Northwestern. Please join me in welcoming Ted Lape.
Well, I'm glad to be here for a number of reasons. One, I was briefly in Rotary for several years with the Tri-Village Rotary, and really enjoyed my experience there because you guys do a lot of great things. My dad was a member of the Bexley and Whitehall Rotary, and my grandfather and great-grandfather, I think, were also members of either that or the Downtown Rotary. So you guys do a lot of great work, and I know a lot of the people here, so it's great to be here. In fact, let's see here if I can. Do I need to do something with the clicker here? Okay, a little quick history just before we get going. Our family owned the Julian and Cocaine Company, and that's where my grandfather and grandfather were involved with Rotary. I actually moved it from Cincinnati to Columbus in the early 1900s. And you may remember this because that building may look familiar. That was the headquarters for the plant. And it's down on between Mound and Main off Front Street. And they're turning that into condos now called the Julian, after the Julian and Cocaine. But there were hundreds and hundreds of people in there making shoes. And it was interesting because that's now being developed by Casto. And my other grandfather was briefly partners with Castro, if you've ever seen the Loving Realtors building on Town Street. So just a brief history that doesn't have anything to do with today, but since we're all from Columbus, I thought you might find that interesting. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about things to consider when you're selling your company. And primarily two things. One, some general things to think about. And then secondly, when people are thinking about selling their company, typically they think there's two options. One, you're going to sell either to a competitor, or two, you're going to sell to a private equity firm. Well, there's actually a third option that I'm going to talk about today, that when we sit down and talk to owners, we don't care what they do, we want to do what they want to do. And this third option today is what most of our clients want to do. So I'll sort of build to that, and we can talk about this third option, which has a lot of wonderful tax advantages, and you guys have probably, some of you have heard of, but may not know a lot about, okay? So first, if you're a business owner, there's a lot of things to think about if you're getting ready to sell your so one of the first things is who controls your revenue. When we get ready to sell a company, sometimes we get in there and we find out there's a salesman who controls all the revenue, and he's got no non-compete agreement. And so the question the buyer always asks is, what's the value of the company without him? Okay, so to what extent is the revenue institutionalized is a very important thing that people consider when they're looking at a company, and something you ought to be thinking about. How do I institutionalize the revenue and have it not dependent on one or two people? Which leads to the second point, which is non-compete agreements. Now, a lot of times people don't like those, and you have to give inducements for people to do those, or maybe you can do something as part of the transaction to get those. But if you have someone who controls your revenue who can leave tomorrow, that's a big detractor from value and something that you gotta be thinking about. The third thing is customer concentrations. We run across this a lot where people will have 50, 70% of their business with one customer. And obviously buyers are concerned about that because what happens if something happens to that customer? And there's another aspect to that. For example, we recently sold a company where the customer didn't want them to sell because if they sold to a competitor, that was going to consolidate the vendor base so that the customer was very concerned the vendor would have the power instead of the customer, and so they pretty much wanted to block that sale. We were able to work through that issue, but it does present a lot of problems. So anything you can do to diversify your customer concentration is always a very, very important thing to do. Okay, is your revenue recurring? And this is, for example, if you think about the difference between a company that sells widgets over and over again to the same customers, that's very valuable. Or if you do service work, as opposed to if you're a contractor and you have to go find the customer every year, that's something that the buyers like a lot less, and the value of your company is a lot less. So for example, if we're talking to contractors, we'll talk to them often about, hey, how do you go get service work? Because that's recurring revenue, and that's a lot more valuable than just going out and having to find new customers every year. So anything you can do to get recurring revenue is always a good thing. Are your contracts assignable? A lot of times, or most of the time, people want to do asset purchases, not equity purchases. What does that mean? Well, if you're just buying the assets, a lot of times the contracts are not assignable, so whatever important contracts you have with your vendors or your customers, those don't go with the sale. So when you're designing your contracts, it's always better if you can make them assignable so that the buyer can actually get those. Okay? Another thing that is really important looking at your business is capital expenditures, because that eats cash. That's if you're buying stuff all the time. So anything you can do to make it where you're not going out and buying equipment all the time is good. So for example, back to the contractor, that service work a lot of times requires less capital expenditures than going out and building things for people, and once again, creates more value, okay? Your legal structure matters, okay? If you're a C corporation, do we have any C corporations in here? We got one C corporation, okay, that's good. There's a lot of tax issues that go along with being a C corporation, for example, that you need to think about up front. If you've got a whole bunch of different entities, that's can be an issue as well. So for example, we just sold a company with 10 entities, and figuring out all the interconnectivity between all those different entities was tough. And so the buyer had some real issues with that. We had to really walk them through that. The more you can simplify your structure, the better. Are your books and records in order? Usually when we get in and look at customers, they can't find things. Like we just sold a company that had 100 truck titles. Well, they couldn't find 50 of them. That's an issue. You got to actually be able to find your books and records and have them in order for people. Key management. If you want to sell your company to a private equity firm, someone's got to run it, and they've got to feel very good about who's going to run it. And a lot of times there'll be holes in the management. Do you have a good CFO? Do you have a good salesperson? Do you have a strong management team across the board? Or are you the owner, the one that's doing everything? Well, if you're the one doing everything, then you're probably not going to be able to sell to a private equity firm because they need management to back. Then you're probably looking at selling to a competitor who's just going to take your customers and put them in their shop. Okay? So to what extent do you have good management across the board? The other thing we find is a lot of time the books, the financials are not GAAP, or they're not in order. And so if you've got a review or an audit, you should really think about having that, a review or an audit, if you're getting ready to sell, okay? Because the buyer wants to make sure that they feel like there's, that the books and records are right, and that a lot of times there's a lot of stuff going on with compilations or with stuff they're just doing internally. They want some third party to say, yeah, these books and records are okay. And so that helps a lot. And finally, we talked about real estate. If you own the real estate and you sell, a lot of times you're going to lose your tenant. Okay? So when you're thinking about, hey, I might want to sell in the future, maybe it's better to rent and to sell your building. Or you have to think about, hey, would someone else want this building if I'm going to sell? And it's better to address that early on than wait until you're ready to sell and then figure out that you're not going to have any tenant. So I'm going very quickly because this is part of a 3-hour presentation I'm doing on Friday to a bunch of Vistage people, so I'm just giving you the highlights. But that's something to think about. Now you get into more, you and your family. So do you want to keep working? If you don't want to keep working and you don't have anyone to run it, that leads you to one kind of buyer. If you want to keep working but get some liquidity, that's a whole different kind of matter. And a lot of people don't know. We'll sit down and talk with them and say, well, what do you want? And they'll say, I don't really know, I haven't thought about it. And then they start thinking about it, and then they figure out, I really like what I'm doing, and they want to stay. Or, I'm ready to go to Florida, I'm tired. Well, that's something you want to figure out before you're going to sell, so you know what kind of person you want to sell to. Plan for the family and the business. This is a big issue because a lot of times there's a lot of family members in the business. And the other issue is usually the owner, and this is a blanket statement, but usually the owner has a higher confidence in their son or daughter than they deserve, okay? And I'm being a little bit controversial saying that, but since I'm saying it as a blanket statement instead of any one of you, I'll say that. So do you want to turn over the company that's perhaps your whole net worth to this unproven person? Well, maybe, maybe you think they're a great talent. But maybe a better answer is to sell it and have enough money you can diversify. I'm sure Jim will tell you diversification's a lot better than having all your eggs in one basket. And then take some of that money and seed the son or the daughter in starting their own company. And that way, you're going to be a lot safer. And then there's also, what if some people are in the family business and some aren't? How do you treat those people differently? A big question people don't think about until they're ready to sell, and then all of a sudden it hits them, is what am I going to do after I sell? Maybe the business has been their whole life for years and years and years, and now all of a sudden they're looking at being at home and, hey, I love my wife, but I don't know if I want to spend, 16 hours a day with her, or I love my husband, I don't know if I want to spend 16 hours a day with him. And that starts to become real, and they think, well, I'm not so sure I want to sell. So that's something you gotta think about. And then finally, is legacy important? This is, I'm the second generation, I'm the third generation, or I built this from scratch. It really means something to me that this company is going to stay around. I don't want it to get consolidated to Omaha and it's gone. Or maybe you don't care. Maybe it's like, hey, I built this and now I'm going to reap the reward of that, and it's okay if it gets consolidated. But that's an important question for a lot of people. Okay? So those are some basic things people think through. There's a lot more, but those are some of the top things that we talk to people about when they're thinking about selling. And that leads me to the other option for selling, which is ESOP alternative. How many people have heard of ESOPs? Oh, good, okay. I know you've got two prominent ones here. CTL Engineering is a wonderful ESOP. And Brian with Messer Construction is also a wonderful ESOP. Are there other ESOP companies here? No? Okay. Well, usually some people know, hey, there's some tax advantages and some other stuff going on, but I'm not quite sure what this thing is. So who's doing ESOPs? In the last year and a half, we've done ESOPs for all these companies here in town. Almost all of those are here in Columbus. And I could tell you, it's surprising to me, 3-4 years ago, when we would sit down with people and go through the various options, most people wanted to sell, go to Florida, get their cash, they were done. Today, we sit down and go through the different options. Most people want to do ESOPs. And that's not what I would have expected. And sometimes I'll even sit down with people who I would bet $1,000 are just going to want to sell to a competitor, and they want to do ESOPs. Well, why is that? Well, first of all, they really like that the company becomes tax-free, okay? You know, there's not a whole lot of places in the world where you can get a tax-free company. And the reason for that is, whether you're an LLC, a C Corp, or an S Corp, you'll end up typically as an S Corporation. And if the owner of an S Corporation is the Employee Stock Ownership Trust, that's a non-tax paying entity, so you got a tax-free company. Well, why is that important? Well, a lot of times people want to sell to their management or the next generation or whatever, but it doesn't work because you're paying with after-tax dollars. And it takes 15 years or whatever, and they're like, gee, I don't want to wait 15 years. With an ESOP, since the government's subsidizing it, and you're tax-free, it usually will take 5 or 6 years. And that includes getting a whole bunch of interest on top of what you're selling for. So that's one reason. The second reason is the owner can sell tax-free, okay? Now, that's not in all situations, but that's in a lot of situations. Especially if you're an LLC or a C Corp, you can sell tax-deferred and it becomes tax-free. If you're an S Corp, you can still do it. It's just a little trickier, and we got to talk about it more. But owners like the fact that they can sell tax-free, especially if you're a C Corporation, where you can have double taxation and typically pay, you know, 55% taxes. Now you're tax-free. And since Congress and Obama raised taxes, this has become more and more attractive to people. And these are two cool things, by the way, to pull out at cocktail parties, because not a lot of people know that. Okay. The other thing is, a lot of times when people think of ESOPs, they think of communism, you know. There's sort of this proletariat vote. The employees are going to get down on the floor and they're going to vote on everything. Well, it doesn't work that way. The way it works is the owner who sold typically is going to be running it after the sale, okay? So there's no owner or employees voting on everything. It's the same people that were running it before running it afterwards if you want, okay? The other thing that has been very attractive is incentivizing key employees and key management. Usually what I hear from owners is, hey, I really like the employees and I'm glad they're going to do well, but I really, really care about 3 or 4 key people. And those 3 or 4 key people are usually the head of sales, the CFO, the head of operations, something like that. And usually they've made some promises to them. They want them to get, you know, something special out of this. Well, in ESOPs, if you make, you know, $150,000 and the other person makes $50,000, you get 3 times as much stock. And then there's also things like stock appreciation rights and management incentive plans for the key employees. So that's another reason people like it, is because the key management gets taken care of and the employees all get taken care of. And if you think about what employees are getting now when they retire, I read somewhere, and Jim and some of the other folks in here can correct me, but the average balance when you retire is like $42,000 for the average employee. With an ESOP, it's a lot higher. And people like that. You also maintain the legacy. You know, you've built a company, you know, you love your company, you want it to continue, you want to show your kids, your grandkids, hey, I built this thing and here it is. With an ESOP, you maintain the legacy. The company stays in place, there's a mechanism for future generations to run it, so people like that. The other thing is, when people think about selling to a competitor, selling to a private equity firm, it seems really painful. You know, I'm going to have my competitor come through, they're going to learn all my secrets. It's a very contentious process. You know, when we represent sellers, we try to make it as painless as possible, but it is contentious because you got someone's trying to win or both people are trying to win, and that creates conflict. With an ESOP, it's a lot less due diligence. Your competitors don't find out anything about you. It's a much friendlier negotiation, and it avoids a lot of the pain and suffering that people view in the process. Oh, and often when we get back to real estate, a lot of times you own a building and you're trying to think, what am I going to do with this building if it doesn't have a tenant? If I sell and my company's gone, who's going to want this building, especially if I'm in a small town? Well, with an ESOP, you maintain a tenant, you sign a long-term lease, and it solves that problem. This is just, you can't really see it in the back, but This is just showing for a company making $2 million a year in EBITDA, which is sort of like cash flow. What's the tax savings? Well, the present value on a 20-year basis of that tax savings is over $13 million, which is a little bit more than the value of the company typically. So you can see people like the fact that essentially the government is transferring so much money to the company that it's enough to basically pay off the owner. Also, ESOPs help to engage the employees. Here's from some third-party studies show during the Great Recession, 9% less layoffs for ESOP companies. Only 13% of employees were thinking of leaving versus 24%, so turnover was lower. 93% of employees thought it was a good idea that they did the ESOP and that people were more productive. The average ESOP company with the same amount of people is $9 million more in sales. And you have better sales and better employment. Why are people not doing ESOPs? Well, the reason people are not doing ESOPs is they want most of their cash at close. Now, there are ways with mezzanine and private equity folks to get more of your cash at close, but typically, if you want most of your cash at close, you want to sell to a competitor, you want to sell to a private equity firm, and that's how you're going to get more cash at close. With an ESOP, you're going to get a chunk at close, but you're going to get it over 5 or 6 years. The biggest thing with ESOPs is you got to have someone to run the company. You got to have management. So again, if you want to go to Florida and hit the beach and there's no one to run the company, you shouldn't do an ESOP. But if you have good management, or typically the seller wants to stay for 3, 4, 5 years, that could be a good ESOP. If you've got under 15 employees, you can still do an ESOP. It gets a little harder though, because it's so powerful to have a tax-free company that the government's put some regulations on that. And they've said, hey, if you got under 15 employees, you can't concentrate the wealth too much in a few people. So that's just something that has to be talked through. And the main reason people don't do ESOPs is they just don't know what the heck they are. You know, they know a little bit about it, they've heard the term, but they just don't know what they are. And the other reason not to do an ESOP is there's just not very much value in the company, because there's some cost to do it. Now, the costs typically are not paid by the seller, but there's still some cost to do it, so that there's just not much value. Okay, don't worry about seeing all the boxes in here. This is just a comparison we do for people about doing nothing, doing an M&A transaction, you know, just selling to a competitor, or doing an ESOP. And what you'll see when you kind of line all this stuff up is the advantage of selling to a third party, again, could be, hey, I get my cash at close. And if you're a company that they could strip out a whole bunch of costs, maybe they can pay a little bit more. If you're not a company where they're going to sort of cut out all the costs, you're going to get about the same amount of money, but you're going to end up getting more money with an ESOP because you're going to get interest on top of your sale price. The other things that people look at here are, again, some of that stuff we talked about earlier. They like it's easier, it's more confidential, there's less due diligence. Those are some of the main things people think about when they're looking at the comparison. And also the post-closing involvement. Hey, if I sell to a third party, they're going to control how long I'm here. If I do an ESOP, I get to control that. Okay, now I'm not going to get too detailed here on how ESOPs work, but basically what happens is the company borrows cash, and then they turn around and they lend it to the ESOP, and then the ESOP buys the shares from the seller with that cash plus a seller note. And that's basically the idea, so that you don't have to sell 100% to the shareholder, but most people do that because that makes you a completely tax-free company. So don't worry about all the boxes, but that's basically the idea. So what you end up with is you end up with bank debt, which is that blue bar, and then a seller note, which is that brown bar, okay? So you got some bank debt and you got a seller note. Well, that seller note's typically going to get a really high return, like 12%, okay? So if you sell your company for $20 million, a big chunk of that is going to be a note owed to you getting 12% interest, okay? This is an example from a feasibility analysis we did for someone showing the owner when he's going to get his money. Now this was a little quicker. They're going to get all their money in 4 years in this example. Normally it's 5 or 6 years, but what you'll see is you get a chunk of cash at closing, which is the bar on the left. And then the second bar in, there's usually a refinance with the bank where you get another chunk of cash. So you'll see that there's this big jump up in the bar where you get another chunk of cash. And then in year 4, you get another big chunk of cash. So you end up getting all your cash in this example in 4 years. And you get a little bit of interest in years 1 and 3. So this is just graphically showing you kind of how you get your money. This is just showing you that because you're getting this really high interest rate, on a quarterly basis, that seller note is growing a lot. So those gold or brown bars are the note amount growing a lot, and then at the end of year 2, it goes down as you refinance, and the same thing happens as you go out to year 4. Okay? And then the bank debt, you'll see, pays down very quickly because you're a tax-free company. So being tax-free means quick pay down. And a lot of that pay down is from excess cash flow. So what we do is we have small mandatory payments, so there's a lot of excess cash flow. And because you're tax-free, there's all this extra cash. The bank will take that and pay down the loan. Okay? So it's mostly from discretionary cash. There's a number of players in an ESOP. Again, you can't read all these boxes from back there, but just a few of them real quick are the trustee, that's your buyer. Okay? There's an independent trustee that buys the stock. They hire a valuation firm to figure out what the value is. And we kind of help bring in all these people. There's, and then there's some lenders. There's the lender, and then there's some lawyers involved in this. You don't need to know all the boxes. But, so there's a number of people involved in an ESOP, and we sort of coordinate that whole process. And then finally, there's about a 16-week time frame, assuming that the books are in order, and there's a number of things that happen in that 16 weeks that we don't need to go through, but that's about the time frame to do an ESOP. Okay? Now I flew through that very quickly just because I wanted to get you the highlights of some things to think about if you're going to sell your company, and then some highlights of, gee, what's this ESOP thing and why are people doing it? And that's it. Yeah, open up for questions.
How did you find mezzanine financing, and what are the levels of financing? I hear mezzanine, startup. What are those terms mean?
What do those terms mean? You're right, I should have probably defined that. Mezzanine is called mezzanine because it's the floor between senior debt or bank debt and equity. Okay, that's all it is. So mezzanine is sort of like part bank debt, part equity. Okay? So what'll, usually it's for companies with strong recurring cash flow. You know, it's not for companies where the cash flow is bouncing all over the place. And so what'll happen is the bank will lend as much as it can, and then typically the mezzanine folks will lend an extra 1 turn of cash flow. What does that mean? A turn of cash flow is basically your net income plus your interest and some other stuff. But so they'll lend a little riskier than what a bank will. And to do that, they'll typically charge 12 to 16%. Some of that in current interest that you owe, and some of that is either accrued interest or with something called warrants, which are like stock options. And that's how they get their return. Okay? And what's happened is mezzanine folks have figured out, hey, with an ESOP, I can lend the same amount of money and have less risk because it's a tax-free company, so there's more cash available. So they've gotten excited about ESOPs. So it is a way to get more cash at close if you want.
Does the end game for an ESOP vary from a private ownership? Say you're out of the business for 10 years and people continuing on. Is it the same type of thing, you know, going public or selling or goals for growth and all that? Or is there subtle differences in this mindset of people?
So I'm not 100% sure of the question. Are there differences in the people that are still there running it and their mindset? Yeah, okay, so what happens is, and I didn't go through this because I was afraid to bore you too much. So the way you get your money out in an ESOP, and this will lead up to your question, is when you leave the company or you retire, the company buys back your stock, okay? So if you're just leaving, you wait 5 years and then it gets paid out over 5 years. Or if you're retiring, you wait a year and it gets paid out over 5 years. But anyway, the company's buying back your stock, okay? But in the meantime, all the employees are very motivated for that stock price to go up. Now the good news is it'll go up naturally, because as you pay down debt, that creates equity, creates higher stock price. But they also want the stock price to go up because the company's making more money. So what you will see in ESOPs is, not the first year, because it takes a while for them to kind of get the hang of it, but that second, third, fourth year, you will see people start to go, hey, hey Billy, why are you leaving at 4:30? Hey Chuck, why are you wasting all that paper? So you do start to get some of that going on in good ESOPs, where they're communicating and they're kind of embracing it. So you do get a mindset shift, but the reward is around the stock price value. So everyone wants to see that stock go up every year.
And then would they eventually want to sell themselves? Or?
Well, so the question is, with an ESOP, do they eventually want to sell? Typically, no, they just keep going. However, what happens is ESOP companies do get approached by third parties who want to buy them. And if it's an equity sale, then the trustee's the one that makes that decision, and they just look at hey, are they going to offer better than the current value, basically. If it's an asset sale, then all the employees get a vote on it, and typically they'll vote yeah, because they're going to get a bunch of cash. But normally they're not out looking to sell. Now, ESOPs can be a wonderful acquisition vehicle, though. And again, this is more cocktail talk, but they can be a wonderful acquisition vehicle, because think about it, if you're a tax-free company and I buy his company, well, now I get 100% of his cash flow, whereas the competitor that buys his company only gets 60% of his cash flow because he's got to pay tax. The other thing is I can offer him the ability to sell tax-free. So if you go to a seller and you say, hey, you can sell tax-free, guess what? Your employees are going to have a better experience. That's powerful. And then on your side, hey, you're tax-free, so you get all the cash flow.
Are there any impending threats to those continued tax benefits, closing loopholes?
The question is, are there any impending threats to the cash flow? To the tax loopholes? And the answer is, that question gets asked every single year, and the answer is no. And I can't say that definitively, who knows, but no. And the reason is twofold. One, both Democrats and Republicans like ESOPs. Democrats like it because it spreads ownership to the people. Republicans like it because it's tax breaks. Okay, so you get both. And they've been around since the 58 or something was the first ESOP. So they've been around a long time. It's only 14 or 15 years ago they let S-corps be ESOPs, and that really made it powerful, because then you had tax-free companies. Before that, you had to be a C corporation, and there were tax benefits, they just weren't as good.
This being an employee stock option plan, how do the employees actually get stock?
Okay, so how do the employees get stock? The employees actually never get stock. The trustee owns the shares for the beneficial interest of the employees. And so what happens is, when an employee leaves, those shares that he had the beneficial interest in are bought back by the company, as we described earlier. Does that answer your question?
I would say more from the incentive standpoint. How do they?
Oh, how is it allocated? Okay. Yeah, and again, we're getting into some details here, but they're cool details. So what happens is, the stock is typically allocated over 15 or 20 years. Okay? Now, in old C Corp ESOPs, there were reasons to do it quicker, and it created some issues. But with the S Corp ESOPs, and again, you get to an S Corp from an LLC, a C, or an S Corp, so it doesn't matter what you are today. But today, usually they're allocated over 15 or 20 years, and the employees vest into those shares. So that'll typically be over a 6-year period, kind of like a 401k, where you're 0% vested the first year, then 20%, 40, 60, 80, 100. Okay, and it's allocated based typically on your compensation.
How are your fees established?
Um, well, the good news is our fees are paid by the buyer, not the seller, but it's a percentage of the transaction price typically. And we make less money on ESOPs than we do on selling you to a third party, so we'd rather sell you to a third party. It's just this is what everyone wants now for some reason. But if you had a specific example, I could tell you the exact fees, but that's the way it works.
What's the range in percents?
The range? It depends on if the company's really is smaller. You know, the smallest that probably makes sense for a company to do an ESOP is probably $1 million or $1.5 million of EBITDA, which is that cash flow thing. Up to, you know, there's billions and billions of dollar companies, and it's a sliding scale. On a really, really small company, you know, it might be, 2% of the value. On a really big company, it might be less.
Okay. Ted, thank you. Join us next week to hear Rick Van Bremer speak on OSU trademark business. Have a great week. Be a Rotarian all week long.